Okay, so my name is Marion Liu, and I'm interviewing Goldie Taylor for the Beaufort Highway Oral History Project. The date is May 2nd, 2019, and we're in Atlanta, Georgia. So, Goldie, can you tell me, where does your name come from?
Oh gosh, I have I've written a little bit about this. I think the origin of someone's name really does tell their history or how connected their family is. My first name is the name of my father's best friend. She owned a nightclub in St. Louis, and her name was Goldie Holly. Goldie's still living today. She's 85 years old, strong as an ox. But her mother's name was also Goldie, and they came from a small township in southern Illinois. They were a biracial Jewish and black family back in the day when that just wasn't it was a rare occurrence to have that happen. Um, and so that was my father's very best friend, but my middle name is things start to get interesting because it kind of tells you who my parents were during that time. So my middle name is Maurita, and it is the mix between Maurice and Rita. Maurice and Rita were frequenters of Goldie's nightclub, but in the months before I was born, they were found murdered, to both of them, in St. Louis in 1968. Maurice was her pimp, and Rita was a sex worker. And so the connectivity of my parents to this other community that they really didn't have a large part of but had an awful lot of respect for wound up in my name. And so Goldie Marita Taylor comes from where my parents were, during that era of 67 to 68, where they were in their young and very lively, fluid lives. Yeah, that's where it came from.
And they were in St. Louis.
They were in North St. Louis and the Central West End section of St. Louis. I was born, raised there, as was my mother. My father was born just outside of St. Louis in a town called Galesburg, Illinois, and had been sent there. His mother had been sent there as a pregnant teenager to have him with an aunt, and she later, being a 17-year-old single mom, married a Army private and moved to Minnesota, where my father was raised, until they returned back to St. Louis in his late teen years. And that's when he met my mom. And so we are St. Louisans, really, through and through. That it had been the city's a bit of a hub for our family.
How long were you in St. Louis, and what was it like growing up?
St. Louis is probably, and still is today, one of the most segregated towns in the country. But when you live there, you don't recognize that because you're living in it. And so we lived in a predominantly black neighborhood in my younger years, predominantly white neighborhood in my older years. I didn't realize that there was a dividing line in the city, that Delmar Avenue was sort of a dividing line between black and white if you lived on one side of it versus the other side of it. That as you drove up St. Charles Rock Road, the further west you went on St. Charles Rock Road, the fewer African American faces and voices you heard and saw. And there weren't other nationalities. It was just black and white in the 1970s. And so today, that's changed. And so now you've got to go pretty far up St. Charles Highway, St. Charles Rock Road, not to encounter, someone of color. And so St. Louis is spreading out in terms of its racial diversity, and it's caused some growing pains, frankly, for the city. We moved to Atlanta, and I remember the exact day. June 5th of 1985 is the day that we drove down 64 to 24 to 75 and came on into this state and moved into a Marriott hotel that sits at the corner of I-75 at Windy Hill Road. My mother was a Marriott employee at the time, and she was coming here to open the Atlanta Marriott Marquis. She was on the opening management team. They just built this fantastic new hotel, with miles of pipe and electricity, and it was a marvel at the time. It was a John Portman project, and the Atlanta Marquee was just it was a world-renowned facility that everyone wanted to go there, to be there, to hang out in its bars, to have events there. It was just, and so we were a part of that. And so we lived in that hotel for about a week on Marriott's dime until we went out and found an apartment. That apartment happened to be at 3399 Buford Highway. And I was 17 years old.
What was that transition like for you to move from St. Louis to Atlanta? And were you?
Well, it was hard because we're talking about 1985. And so we're just a few years beyond the Atlanta Chalmers. So all that I ever heard about Atlanta is that children like me, children my age, people who looked like me, that they were dying. And that there was some question as to whether or not they had convicted even the right man. And so I was afraid at 17 of coming to an unknown city that I had never once visited. And I was heading into my senior year in high school, no less. And so who wants to leave before your senior year in high school? To be uprooted in that way, but the hotel was going to open and we were coming. I cried the entire 8.5-hour drive because I was afraid of what I would see when I got to Georgia. The only other thing I knew about Georgia is that y'all were part of the Confederacy and there was this flag waving thing going on, and I was afraid that the Klan was alive and well in Georgia. And so all I knew were about these sort of highly racialized stereotypes about the South, about the state in particular, and that there was an existential threat present for me that black children were dying. And so I didn't want to come.
Did you not feel that in St. Louis? Even
No.
though it was highly segregated?
Highly segregated, and let me tell you that the neighborhoods I lived in St. Louis were not the safest places to be in the daytime or at night. But it was, the temple of your familiar. And that, when you're living that way in an everyday, this was a brand new threat that I could not see or identify. I knew the threats in my neighborhood. I knew how to navigate and avoid them. And this was a brand new landscape for me. And as a 17-year-old, I just couldn't calculate up, that I couldn't put it in, I think, the appropriate perspective. And so I was leaving a boyfriend, my very first love. Hi, Daryl Poindexter. So I was leaving a lot really behind. And, with no real assurances from my mother that things were going to be great and brand new. But come on, kid, get in the car. I've got a new job and it's gone, this is a good opportunity. And you'll go to school in Atlanta and you'll be just fine. And for me at 17, nothing was just fine. Nothing could be. When you're 17, nothing ever is.
Was it just you and your mom?
It was. My sister and brother were all grown up, moved out. So they weren't forced to make this move at the time. So they were grown up, moved out, and had children of their own. My sisters and brothers are 7 and 9 years older than me, respectively. And so it was just my mom and I. And the apartment that we moved into, and we'd done a lot of looking. But this place was great. There was this glistening pool. By the way, it's no longer there. But there was this glistening pool. I think there was a Walgreens or something on the corner. On the corner of Buford Highway at Briarwood, there's sort of a dip. There's a food mart over here. But across the street, there's this Walgreens, and there's sort of, in that dip was a sprawling apartment complex that had hundreds of units. And it had a beautiful pool, but there was one hitch. It was adults only. So back during that day, you could have a community that restricted children. So no children under 18 lived in the units. And I was just turning 17. There was a full year before I'd be 18 years old. And we signed the lease, and my mother promptly put down my birth date as July 18th, 1967, rather than 68. And we moved in, and it was I remember our rent was $440 a month, 2 bedrooms. We'd owned a home in St. Louis, but we'd sold that home, and suddenly I was surrounded by lots of really cool college kids and young professionals and people that I had not been exposed to before. And so moving there was, there was a brand new sense of community for us almost immediately.
What else did you find there?
At 17 years old, what else did I find? I found boys, lots of boys. Buford Highway was crawling with teenagers during those years. I mean, and they were from nationalities I had never ever encountered before. And so Pablo Silva, who was in my senior class homeroom, was from Venezuela. We had kids from Uruguay. We had kids from Aparna was from India. I mean, she was, had just arrived, within the recent couple of years before I met her. There were just so many, and so I found a racial diversity that I had never experienced before in my life. That there were, we were still fairly a predominantly white community along Buford Highway, by the way. I mean, from the connector clear out to Johns Creek, where the whole thing is. Buford Highway is still largely a homogeneously white community. There were just a few of us who happened to be, black and brown and from other nations and cultures and nationalities. It was just an interesting mix that I had not encountered, and we found ourselves making our own sort of sub-community within us. So if you were from Venezuela, you're probably the only kid from Venezuela. If you were if you're from South Asia, you're probably the only kid from South Asia. So there was just a very different, it was sparse, but the beginnings of the plantings of the racial diversity that Buford Highway now has and is enriched by was just beginning to start.
Do you know why that is? What made Buford Highway attractive for people from different places?
It was still affordable then. It was a highly affordable community, and it was the accessibility into downtown where the service shops were. That there was this MARTA station, the Brookhaven MARTA station was just over the way, and so you would take this, I forgot the bus line, you grab this bus off Buford Highway and you wind straight up into this Brookhaven MARTA station, and maybe it's a 23, I don't know, and you wind up there, and you could go downtown, which was where everything was at the time. I mean, there was a Macy's store downtown, there was a Rich's store downtown, there were all these brand new hotels. The jobs were at the center of the city still. In terms of working in Johns Creek, no one worked in Johns Creek back then. What do you mean drive to North Cross to go to work? No one did that. You went downtown. And so Buford Highway was still a hop, skip, and a jump from every meaningful job to be had. And there was a growing immigrant community of university students. So I lived across the hall from an African girl who went to Spelman. And Valerie became kind of a big sister, really for me. And so if you were at Spelman or Morehouse, there was a kid around the way, Eric Bridges, who was a Morehouse student at the time. There were two more Morehouse guys. They were super cute, by the way. Two more Morehouse guys right up the hill and in our apartment complex. So I didn't have to go far. And so there was this diversity of immigrants. They were, seeking this affordable housing, places where they could live and be easily accessible to, where they're going to work, going to school. And Buford Highway was that. It was connected.
You said you and your mom were at that Marriott in Windy Hill Road for a week?
Yeah.
So it took you only a week to find housing?
Only took us a week.
Why did you all choose Buford Highway?
Well, there weren't my mom really liked the idea that she drove a Pontiac, wasn't a Fiero, although I wish it was a Fiero. The car was hot. It was like forgot the name of her car already. She drove this little black sedan, and she could literally hop on Buford Highway and be at work in minutes. She would cut down that connector, onto Peachtree, cut down the connector, cut down the Buford Highway connector, and onto the 7585 connector, and at Cortlandt Street, she was off and into the back driveway of the Marriott. My mother has always hated a commute. Even today, I mean, she's like 78, 79 years old. She hates getting onto highways to go anywhere. And so the connectivity to work for her, school wasn't even the consideration. There will be a high school close around here and you will go to it. Really was the choice. But it really was proximity to her job. I remember back then, there was no internet. There was no Zillow or, rent.com. There were none of these places. But there was an apartment finder places, ProMove, There were companies that had basically staff that would take newcomers, because lots of newcomers were here at that time. I mean, that was what I call we were in the middle of a migration wave, and African Americans specifically were moving to Atlanta in droves during that time. We had no idea that we were part of that wave. They were coming here to go to school, they were coming here to go to work, and they weren't going back north. So there was a return of African Americans to the South happening at the time. And it was because, the mayor was black. You got Andy Young, and then you had Maynard Jackson. And so there was this black political power that was attractive. My mother and I weren't aware of this, by the way, but we moved in the middle of what became a black renaissance in Atlanta. And so these pro-move places were set up for people just like us. They were waiting. And they would take us around to tell us, what are you looking for? 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, carpets, what do you want? And they would take us specifically to where we want to go. What we didn't know is that these companies had these financial arrangements with apartment communities to steer people their way. And we went to Buford Highway, looked at one apartment. Yeah, it's too expensive for us. I think it was $500. And we went down the road and we passed by and said, hey, what about that one? And they took us inside. It happened to be Bordeaux, and we moved in days. Yeah.
What would you say the reputation of Buford Highway was then?
Back then, it was just a middle-class community. There were lots of homes in front of us, in the Dresden community, Briar Road and all that. There was people who had lived there, their whole lives, bungalows and ranch-style homes that had been built. There was a predominantly black neighborhood on the other side of Brookhaven's MARTA station, Linwood Park. Gentrification had not come to Buford Highway just yet. And so we were in an unsoiled, in-town enclave of working-class folks, who still liked laying by the pool, on the weekends. And it was, as I said, affordable for my mom, who was, a director-level person working, running bars and restaurants at a Marriott hotel, that we could afford to do it. So, but that level of, I guess, tranquility was disrupted pretty quickly, even while I still lived there. The cranes started moving. The homes were being demolished, apartment complexes were starting to come down. And perfectly good-looking places, by the way, where people were still living, that they were buying people out of their leases. And because the land, as where Buford Highway sat, was so valuable that these affordable units could not stand for long. And so Lenox Road was not developed. Lenox Road and all those wonderful high-rises that came starting around 85 and clear into 1990, where they built these, what were at the time hugely expensive high-rises and mid-rises and townhomes. And we looked in awe, like, wow, this is some amazing stuff. There is a community that now sits between Cross Keys High School in the back of Lenox Mall that is called Lenox Park. Offices, apartments, townhomes, that was all forest when I was in high school. There was no cut through to get from Cross Keys to Lenox. You had to go all the way back around Druid Hills Road and circle back around to get. Now there is a cut through as if it's been there the whole time. And so we moved at the front edge of a redevelopment that literally drove people from their apartments and from the homes that they had lived in their entire lives. And so now my school friends, that we're all in our 50s, they live in the outer reaches of Atlanta. The parents sold and they moved to first to Norcross and then to Forsyth, and some people moved to Cherokee County, some people moved to Roswell. But there was a gutting of the communities that I don't know on balance if it was the right or wrong thing, really. But I know that there were some families who were hurt by the new development because, frankly, they couldn't afford to live in the neighborhoods that they had raised their children in anymore. And so that was tough, I think. And I think rents dropped for some complexes that still stand. And so, you got, and these are all privately held. So there are some absentee landlords on Buford Highway now that weren't there before. prior, when someone owned an apartment complex, they were right here in town, and you could reach out to the management company because they were right here in town. But now you've got those very same complexes that have been sold to outside investors who aren't necessarily interested in the growth and sustainability of the community. They're interested in the rents that are being drawn. And so there's sort of a mix now of beautiful new developments and lower income homes that could probably use a good bit of attention. The neighborhood in general has flipped in terms of its cultural mix in a way that I think is important and has been thrilling. Because if you want Korean barbecue, you go to Buford Highway now. That wasn't true then. If you want the best Chinese buffet in the whole world, Buford Highway is the only place to go and get great dim sum in this city. And so it has become. They took the plaza that I used to work in. I worked in a Foot Locker shoe store. I'm sorry, not Foot Locker. Finish Line. They would be upset if I confused the two. I worked in a Finish Line shoe store at a mall near the corner of Dresden and Buford Highway. It is now Plaza Fiesta, I think, which I am just like, wow, this is absolutely, blows your mind. But I think in that redevelopment, a lot of businesses fled, but it opened the door for some other really interesting and rich cultural diversity to move right in. Northeast Plaza at the corner of Briarwood at Buford Highway, there used to be a Sears outlet store there. I was a cashier there. There used to be a bowling alley over there and a movie rental store, movie stop or something or other like that. There was it a Fridays? Or was it Fridays around there, and a Copeland's adults restaurant. I mean, there had been a Payless shoe store. There were just some really interesting, cool businesses around there that just aren't there anymore. But what has moved in, I think is probably, is the Old Country Buffet still there? Northeast Plaza, maybe, I don't know. There was an Old Country Buffet girl, ate there all day and night. But the changes that have occurred have been driven by two things. One, the gentrification of, housing and the bringing in of a wealthier class of citizenry, but also what was left in terms of multifamily housing. The prices dropped, and so it brought in a cultural diversity that we didn't have really before. So it's a strange phenomenon. I still live close by, because it's still home for me in so many ways. I had a lot of fun. I got in a lot of trouble. I left a mark on Buford Highway, I believe. But I decided that when I wanted to raise my own children, that I wanted to raise them, in a close and nearby community. And so we never really left North Buckhead, North DeKalb. Never really left it.
Tell us about the drag racing.
Joy Butler, if you can hear me, I'm calling your name. I had my best girlfriend I met at Cross Keys, was a chick named Joy Butler, and her brother Kenny. So my mother, to appease me, to make me feel better about this move, decided she'd buy me a car. So we saw this ad in the newspaper. There was no online at the time. $99 down, $99 a month for a Mercury Lynx, which looked a lot like a Ford Escort. So she bought me this black Mercury Lynx. It was new. And so I was a senior in high school with a new car. And everybody was like, ooh, the new girl has a new car. And Joy and I got into that car and blazed our way around Buford Highway. And so I did not participate in the drag races, but I was certainly present for them. And so, and the new car attracted people, friends, boys, folks who just wanted to ride to the drive-in or the party or whatever it was. And it was during that era, around 85 to maybe 87, that drag racing up Buford Highway became a thing. That at night you could hear the motors revving from stoplight to stoplight, because it was the only in-town street on our side that looked just like a highway. I think the speed limit was 45 back then, maybe even 50. So here you had a major thoroughfare where the speed limit was 45 or 50, and you could and at night it was blank. There was no one out there, so you had a clear shot from all the way up from 285 clear down to the connector where the Days Inn Reservation Center used to be. You had a clear shot to pick your corners, and there was some excitement. There was a lot of drag race tailgating, so lots of teenage beer drinking, and late nights at the fast food restaurants. There was a Domino's pizza that came in over there, and so we'd order a Domino's pizza and sit out on the Northeast Plaza corner and drink beer and eat pizza and watch the next race lineup. And there wasn't a lot of, I wouldn't say police let us do what they wanted to do, but they had other things to do until the first major accident where somebody got hurt. Then people realized that drag racing up Buford Highway was a real problem. Yeah, and so now I think there's a big crackdown, and the cars got faster over time, and the kids got younger, and so now it's a thing, yeah, and a dangerous thing.
When was the first major accident?
It was after we moved, but I think it was in 88 or 89, because I was either pregnant or having a first child because my husband and I had moved up Buford Highway, up Peachtree Industrial to almost into what is now Johns Creek. And so we had got dispatched from the community all the time. I think it was probably 88 or 89, and a young man died. It was like Mustangs and big muscle cars, and the car flipped is what we'd heard, and big fire blaze, and but I think it's probably the late 80s when the first major happened. But I think there have been others since that. Every once in a while you read there was another major accident. Yeah, it's always somebody it's always somebody young and male. I think they've all been boys so far. In that strip right in front of where we used to live, because it has tips, is the perfect place. Yeah, if you want to rev your engines. Yeah, there was ours would start at the Kroger. There was a Kroger store, probably still there. Kroger store down near, I guess that's Dresden at Buford Highway. There was a laundromat over here, which I think is still there. And the Kroger was back here. There was a liquor store and a book nook here in this corner. The book nook was the best used bookstore you could ever find in your whole life. If you wanted comic books from the 50s, they were in there. But our races would start at that corner, run the full length of almost the full length of Buford Highway down the Northeast Plaza. And so right in that big section is, it is a straightaway, but there's a couple of brief hills that are long enough that you won't go flying over the hill or anything. But the difficulty is, on both sides of the street, there are these gullies that go into the apartment complexes. So flipping off, that's why there are guardrails, by the way, on Buford Highway. There weren't guardrails before. Yeah, and so now there are these metal guardrails along the sides, both sides of the street, because kids were flipping down these hills. Yeah, it's too bad.
What are the other hangout spots for you when you were a senior?
When I was a senior, other than out in a park, somebody's parking lot. There was a teen club. Now, where was it? There were a couple of them. There was a teen club up Roswell Johnson Ferry Road that we would kind of roll up to. I thought there was something over here at Roswell at Blackland Confetti. Our main, and by the way, our main goal every Friday night was to get into an adult club. That was the goal. The goal was to get into an adult dance club. Limelight, Confetti, Club 112. The Phoenix was a big African American nightclub at the time. Club 131 was. Our main goal every Friday and Saturday night was to get into a grown-up club. Because back then, the drinking age was still moving. So when I moved to Atlanta, the drinking age was 18. And it was moving up progressively. The next year it was 19, then it moved to 20. And it was tied to highway bill dollars So if your state didn't move that driving age, didn't move up that drinking age, you were going to miss out on all this highway dollars until you reached the 21 years old progression. So I was a year behind. So I was 17 and by the time I turned 18, ready to drink, the age was now 19. So I was always chasing the drinking age. So Joy and I's main goal was to get dressed up on Friday night and dress like grown women, like 19-year-olds, and get ourselves into the Phoenix nightclub or get ourselves into V's Figure Eight, the nightclub down on Peachtree, which was hugely famous. So that was our goal. And so other kids were doing other, kid fun things. We were trying to get into the nightclub. That was our deal. Yeah.
Would you say that was what most of
No.
the kids at Cross Keys were also trying?
No, we were just crazy. No, Joy and I were just nuts. We just had a whole different thing about where we thought our lives were going. And I wanted to be a singing star. So, being in clubs, they'd have an open mic night, time to sing. And, my little tone deaf self would get on the stage and, attempt to win something. But no, the other kids were doing kid things. They were going to football games. They were going to, tailgates. They were still having sleepovers and having, good fun. Joy and I were a different breed, and that was just a very, there was an awful lot of drinking for two young girls at 18, 17, 18 years old. That just,
Where did that come from?
Joy, no, just kidding. Joy and I were the same age, and she's a bartender, I think, today, so it stayed with her. Joy showed me another side of the world that I also had not seen before, the world of the house party. And I'm like, wow, kids and beer and house parties, this is amazing. And so there was if there's a coming of age story, it was Joy Butler and I with this little black Lincoln Mercury, Lynx car, in search of, the eternal buzz, from house party to house party, because we couldn't get into the club, we'd wind up at somebody's house, which was invariably it, because every bouncer in the world, knew us on sight. You again. Yeah, you again.
Whose house? Where?
It was Troy Delgado's house, who became my high school boyfriend at the time. And when I was a senior, it was his house, and his brother. They still live here in Atlanta. I think Fayetteville, southern section of Atlanta. It was Troy Delgado's house and his cousins, and we had really, I think, we had a good time. Boy, did we! We had a good time. But it was Troy who first told me that I was a writer. Who said, this is good, you should do something with that. And so there was a beginning, a planting there of hanging out with Joy and his cousins, and it seemed like everybody in Crossroads was related in some way. But there was a planting of being with him over that year, around that my writing was something that I should look at as important. That it wasn't just a high school essay or that I was beginning to write at that time that had, in a way that had nothing to do with an assignment. And I hated going to school. I just wanted to be home and write. So, a high school counselor at Cross Keys, and I forget his name, in March, we were in the trimester system back then. After the second trimester, looked at my transcript and said, you have enough credits to graduate. And you don't have to be here this next semester if you don't want to be. And I didn't. I wanted to, hang out with Joy on the weekends, and I wanted to write. And that is exactly what I did. I took the early graduation. I did not march with my class, because I didn't have real connectivity to a lot of them. I did not march with my class. I did not go to the baccalaureate. None of those things. I took the signature of the credit, and I took off. And I spent probably I spent that spring, that summer, probably writing the first in a series of short stories over time. And so that's when I started.
What were the stories about?
Kids getting drunk on a weekend mostly. The stories weren't particularly good. They were very, very much in the moment kind of stories, as I recall. They were, basically, if you went back and read them today, they were just about a 17-year-old girl finding her way, navigating her way through life. And I didn't have any particular connection to other Black writers, but I sure love Judy Blume, and Flowers in the Attic and all those other kinds of things. Are You There, God Is Me, Margaret? Those are the kinds of things that attracted me most at the time. And so those are the kinds of things that I was trying to write. I was trying to, mimic or identify closely with those coming-of-age stories.
Do you remember what it was that Troy Delgado read that made?
I think it was just an essay, that I had written something, maybe for our English lit class or something, but I think it was just an essay from school, and he just found it in the notebook. Hey, this is good. You should do more of this, And I said, well, I do. I write all the time, and he wanted to see the rest of the stuff, and so I don't think I ever showed him the rest of the stuff because I was a little more, hesitant than that, reticent than that. But he saw a couple things, and I was writing poetry at the time. I really suck at poetry. But I was writing poetry at the time, and he thought, this is really, really good stuff. Yeah. And we were into love letters, too. So Joy and I would write letters back and forth, so that was part of it. Yeah. I don't think I've written a love letter since. Maybe I have. Maybe. So that was the thing. It was, that was kind of when I decided I had a voice that needed to be found. And then I think I went mute for a long time. And didn't turn back to writing until I was probably in my middle 20s. And at that point, I was writing every day, something every day, whether it was a news story or a fiction short story, or I was writing something every single day. And I still cannot get away from it, but it's always reflective of, my own experiences. And so a Buford Highway will pop up in Paper Gods, or, Lennox Mall will pop up, in the next book. These things are always sort of you write what you know, and I've spent the better part of my writing career writing exactly what I know, with a little, flair here and there, a few flourishes, but yeah.
What is your usual advice? Do you have usual advice for young writers or aspiring writers?
Do it, and do it a lot, and read everything. I think you're a better writer when you're a better reader. So I think the people get bogged down, and I'm a stickler for form, and all those things, and sentence composition, and I could probably teach an English lit class, or composition class, but there comes a time when you basically throw it away. There comes a time you throw form away, you throw sentence structure away, and you just find your own voice, and you become a storyteller, rather than somebody who's just sort of stringing sentences together. And so that only happens when you do it a lot, when you're playing around with, testing, tinkering with, when you allow yourself to play on the page. That mastery of voice only comes then. Yeah.
What is the role Atlanta has played in your voice, in your storytelling? Because in Paper Gods, it's a character in itself.
It certainly has made it more clear, a clarity of voice. I have an affinity for this city that I certainly didn't have at 17 coming down I-85 moving here. This is home today. I couldn't imagine that I would have raised my children or lived anywhere else during all of these formative years. And so the city has become a part of who I am. It informs my storytelling, it informs, my work. And so for me, Atlanta itself is another character. And when I write stories, I write Atlanta as a fully fleshed and round character. So, and I think in that way, the city has become very important, really, to me. But having worked in its politics, having worked in its major newsrooms, having been around its so-called movers and shakers, I have another understanding of Atlanta that most folks don't always get to see. And so I've decided to tell that story. I've had access to some of the smoky back rooms, so I've decided to tell the story of some of the smoky back rooms, which I think really is what Paper Gods does, opens up an avenue to character and story that hadn't been opened before. And so I think that's a part of it. If you remember, maybe in the early 90s, there was a book called The Manifold. It was written by the terrific Tom Wolfe. The amazing, it's an opus. I have a copy of it upstairs. It's based in Atlanta, and it purports to tell the story of. And when you read it, it could be any city on earth. A Manifold is an incredible story, but he could have been talking as easily about Seattle or Washington, D.C. That the story itself is not so specific to Atlanta. And I, had written a couple other novels, and that story just never left me. And so when I decided to write Paper Gods, I wanted to write a story that hadn't been told, that maybe Tom Wolfe had wanted to tell but had missed. I felt that he had missed a lot about Atlanta. And so that's where Paper Gods came from. Paper Gods is my version of a Manifold. I just decided to open the door and tell the rest of the story. Yeah. It's much shorter, too. It's much shorter. I think I get it done in maybe 300 pages. I think his is like 900 or something like that. Yeah.
But you're going to tell the sequel, too, so there's more to say.
There is more to say. There probably is a sequel or two behind this. And Paper Gods is going to be a TV show. And so lots of folks are going to get to see Paper Gods on their tiny screen at home. I don't know which network yet, but a production company has optioned it, and we're off to the races. Yeah.
Congratulations.
So I'm excited. I'm living in an exciting time.
What is it saying that Atlanta, the TV show, isn't saying? It's very different.
It's very different. There are other shows on television that are set in other cities, but the intersection of politics and pop culture in Atlanta, I think, is what I talk mostly about in the book, and I think will be compelling because you can't, between faith and business and entertainment and politics, all these communities run together in Atlanta. It's kind of hard to tell which room you're really standing in, and so I bring that to life, I think, in the book, and I hope that as we produce it for television, that the level of realism that I gave to it, it's a bit of a cross between House of Cards and Scandal, but it looks like The Wire. So I am hoping that our production team can bring it to life in the way that I think I intended it.
What is Atlanta's story? What is the voice that you're giving to Atlanta that people don't know?
I think Atlanta has, and this was evident in Buford Highway, Atlanta has a social contract that, there are South Side African American voters predominantly, and North Side largely white families who control the purse strings. Mayors are elected out of that contract. New development happens out of that contract. Now there are these new developers of other races and nationalities. It's kind of shaking things up now, isn't it? The landscape is certainly changing, but that contract was brokered in the early 70s with the election of Maynard Jackson, and it has sustained itself through all of these decades. Now it's coming undone because the dynamics of the city, the demographics are changing. The centers of power are shifting, and no longer do sort of these cabals of political machines control things. People understand the power of their individual vote and their power to organize individually. And so the centers of power are breaking apart, and the social contract is a brand new contract is coming to growth. And so the story of Atlanta is waiting to be written. It's what that new contract will look like. It may not be as clear as the last one, but there will be a social contract in a way that we do business in the city, and I think it's changing. Yeah.
You said that's evident on Buford Highway. Can you explain more about that?
Well, I think it's in the way that the development came. That, Buford Highway was a predominantly white neighborhood. And now look, the languages and the nationalities represented is a potpourri, a cacophony of, just cultures. That was not true in 1985, nor was it true even as late as 2000, 20 years ago. But progressively over time, Buford Highway has now its own, its own, you know, its own sort of power, and how it votes and why it votes, it isn't sort of run quite the same way. And so it used to be unincorporated DeKalb County. It now is a city with a police department, and it is now a city with a mayor and a council. That's a very, very different thing. It now can stop development, whereas it could not before. When they developed Lenox Road and along Brookhaven and back through Dresden, developers pretty much had their way because they could just go to the capital and say, I'm going to do this, and they did it. Today, MARTA tried to do a transit-oriented development at the Brookhaven MARTA station. And the city of Brookhaven and others said, no. We want to preserve our communities. We want balanced and sustainable growth. We want to make certain that the communities continue to have or hold on to, their cultural basis. And they said no. And so nothing's being built on top of that. They were going to build on top of the MARTA station, which it looked really incredible. But it wasn't in line with what the people of Brookhaven, this new Brookhaven city, wanted. And so now it has a political power that it did not have in '85. It could have had more say in what Lenox Road looks like. It could have had more say in what Buford Highway looks like, or even Northeast Plaza, or any of the other developments that came along. It could have had more say. It didn't because it wasn't organized. Today it is. Today it's organized. And I think that's how the contract is changing. People are forming their own basis of political power.
Who is most desperate to hold on to the old social contract?
The people who made the money. The people whose families became wealthy from the old social contract. And so if you look at the airport as an economic engine, if you look at the development community as an economic engine, if you sort of take a look at where the city and county contracts flowed to, those are the people who have the most skin in the game when it comes to maintaining the old social contract. Because if you bust the old contract, that opens up more opportunity for a lot more people competing with you. And, it's cheaper not to compete. So you want the old contract if it keeps other people from competing for wealth.
Do you think the people who held the power in the old social contract are doing their hardest
No.
to try to,
Oh, yeah.
try to ensure that the people who have the most to gain are now buying into that old contract? Or
They'd like to believe that the old contract still exists. Is what it is. I think they're still, by and large, living in the delusion that the old contract still exists and that it will persist for some time. But you don't have to be blind to see a Whole Foods come up at the corner of 14th and Spring West Peachtree. You don't have to be blind to see some of the things that are happening in town and how this contract is changing. If you look at the last several mayoral elections and the racial makeup of the electorate, if you look at what Stacey Abrams was able to do against Brian Kemp in this last, call him Matt Kemp, the football player, against Brian Kemp in this last gubernatorial election, then you have got to see that the old contract is coming apart, not because somebody came along and busted it, but because we outgrew it. And this is growth that you're not going to be able to turn back. Georgia is going to be progressively more racially diverse. It's going to be more racially diverse over time, and that's going to be changes in who controls the political purse strings in the state. It's just what it is.
do you get pushback for saying things like that?
Yeah, sure. Sure they do. Every once in a while, I do. But I'm the cranky old lady on the corner, so they push back quietly typically because I think they're afraid I'll write about them or something. They'll become a character in a book or something. No, it's I think political scientists in general, and that's why I studied at Emory, by the way, is political science. Political science in general, scientists in general will tell you, can show you the data of how Georgia is growing and why. And so there's really no disputing that. Where you get the pushback is, "Oh, Goldie, we're not trying to protect the old contract." To which I give them a side eye and I keep it moving. Keep it moving. So I think that's kind of, if there's any pushback, it's we're not who you say we are. Yeah, if there's any.
Is the Black Renaissance still alive and well in Atlanta?
It's become something else. There was a huge renaissance of Black art, of like young people graduating from the Atlanta University Center, starting new enterprises. There was a huge burst of excitement starting probably in the middle 80s and moving clear probably into 2005. And this migration of folks, the migration is reversing. Those who came and stayed decades, their children are moving back to Chicago, back to New York, back to DC, back to where they were coming. So the migration toward Atlanta, that has stopped. It was a wave. In 1985, you could literally see the cars packed with household goods coming down the highway. People were just coming every day. And so that has stopped because of the economic growth of the homes that they left. Atlanta was a boom town during that time. The boom isn't quite over, but we have the people here are able to sustain it, I think. And so that part of the Renaissance is probably ebbed for now. It'll be back. I think Atlanta's just a place where the cost of living and quality of life, are really pretty good. Low cost of living for high quality life. You can get an awful lot for your money here. I think that will continue to attract people of all persuasions. But in terms of the wave, I think that's ebbed for now. Yeah, just for now.
The ebbing, is that contributing to the undoing of the social contract?
It is. Well, if you look at the last mayoral election and you figure out who's voting where, the percentage of the in-town electorate is changing. The new high-rises, the new high-rises like this. When you look around and see who your neighbors are, go, well, you weren't living in the city a few years ago. And there is a very different, while we became a more diverse city, some of those whites who fled to the suburbs in the 80s and 90s are back. And their children are back, living in town. East Atlanta, Grant Park, Inman Park, full stretches of, the West Side Corridor that was all black. Now there's this belt line. The old Fourth Ward, where predominantly black communities are now much more diverse than they ever had been. And so a brand new contract is coming to fore. We just don't know all of what it will look like yet.
What do you think it looks like?
I think it's incredible. I think with all the brand new, mixes of race, religion, and cultures and language coming in, I just think it is an amazing thing. There are some folks who are very, very hesitant, though, because as I say in the book, Victoria Dobbs thinks, there might be a white mayor in Atlanta. There are some people who are afraid that there will be a white mayor in Atlanta. And, and they're probably right that there will be because of how, many more African Americans are moving to the suburbs. And how we are voting in town seems to point to that. I'm just wondering what the fear is, though. I'm trying to figure out, if that person is right and represents and experienced and all the things that we look for in a great mayor. Who cares, what racial background he or she hails from. But yeah, I think there are some people who are worried about losing the mayor's office. That this is what Maynard Jackson fought for. Well, this is exactly what Maynard Jackson fought for. He fought for a larger and greater access to the economic pie. And now it's here, and increasingly for more and more people. And that might mean that as a voting bloc, African Americans have diffused their votes into Sandy Springs and Douglasville and Stone Mountain and other places where we're moving to, and Brookhaven and other places that we're moving to, so that now the city, how a mayor or a city council is elected out of that new tapestry, will certainly be an interesting thing to see.
What is your gut feeling?
Oh, we'll have a white mayor soon. Yeah, I could probably tell you who it is. But yeah, no question. Yeah, I've had, there are a great number of, probably won't be Mary Norwood, but I think I have a Sarah Mitchell.
That's on the record.
I know. I think I have a Sarah. I think I have a Sarah Mitchell in the book. So hey, Mary as well. I have a Sarah Mitchell in the book who is my Mary Norwood person in the book. And there is every character represents somebody or somebody's, or group of people. But
so who is Victoria Dobbs?
Victoria is actually a mix of people, but I had to erase every other mayor from the book in the modern era to create her.
Oh.
And so I know Kasim Reed well. I know Bill Campbell extremely well. I had to erase them to create Victoria because I didn't want my friends to say, I'm not like that. But I did. I all at once erased our 4 previous mayors and created a brand new one based on both the best and worst attributes of those that I knew. Yeah. So she is somebody and nobody. But everybody else in the book is a mix of sort of other people. But in terms of mayors, we've got, Peter Amon is an incredible human being and businessman here in the city. I wouldn't be surprised if he stepped into the ring again. There was a State House Representative Kathy Ashe. She has a son, Robbie Ashe, who had been an assistant to Kasim Reed and to Shirley Franklin. He's probably a viable candidate coming in the future. There are a number of people who happen not to be black, but who have their own basis of political power that could lead them straight to the mayor's office. And so there are probably any number of folks out there who, probably not anyone who's been elected. It'll likely be someone who's either a lawyer today or has come from the business community, but it will be somebody who has been able to create a bridge between communities. Someone who is as comfortable walking through Cascade as he is through East Atlanta as she is through, the West Side Quarry District, who is at ease here in Buckhead, as they would be, in Druid Hills. Could be it will take a very special person to pull off. But I think that person's out there.
What is the social contract do you think that person will be offering?
I think that person's going to talk about greater equity, access to prosperity for all Atlantans. I think that person's going to talk about how we are better together, that we are stronger when we work on one accord. I think that person's going to talk about preservation of neighborhoods and smart managed growth because the growth that we're seeing in Atlanta, frankly, scares people. I think that person's going to talk about affordable housing and poverty and how we, as one of the richest cities on earth, how do we still have people living in Woodruff Park? I think, that person's going to talk about how Georgia State is growing and Georgia Tech and the growth and how do we support that in a really smart, manageable way. They're going to talk about economic and environmental sustainability and how this city serves its people rather than people simply living in it. And so it could be an interesting, and it will start soon. This very next cycle, I think we're going to see new candidates. And I don't think it will take very long after that before we see a change in or a manifestation of what the new social contract will look like.
Do you think that'll happen in Mayor Bottoms' first election? Or
Her first
term?
reelection.
Or
It could happen when she stands for reelection. She may get some opponents, depending on how strongly she runs this term. She may draw, but Atlanta's not very good. We're very good at reelecting mayors. So her chances of being reelected are very good, just who we are. But the term after that, when the seat is open, when anybody, all comers, I think that's when we're going to see a manifestation of what this contract looks like.
So my last question is, what is Buford Highway's role in Atlanta's story?
Well, Buford Highway decided that it wanted to be Brookhaven. That is an important thing to kind of put in here. But its proximity to the city it just sits at its water's edge. And so you can't live in Brookhaven and not be a participant in Atlanta. 2 blocks up Peachtree is the Brookhaven line, 2 blocks from here. So I live right on the city of Brookhaven line. So things that happen in Brookhaven impact me things that happen here in my community impact the folks in Brookhaven. And so I think that's part of it is that they aren't, while they've separated from Atlanta jurisdictionally, they're still pretty much a part of the political framework of the city. I do think that Brookhaven's diversity will at some point embrace its own power, because today it's historically white neighborhoods still have the political power in Brookhaven. That's going to change just by the sheer numbers of things, and I don't think it will be very long before it does. Yeah, so you may have an Asian or Hispanic mayor in Brookhaven before you can shake a stick. Yeah, I think that could very well happen. Absolutely.
What does that mean for Atlanta?
I think one of my old schoolmates is mayor's, or at least he was a year ahead or behind me, something like that. I think I know the old mayor from like high school years or something, the mayor from high school, something. Maybe. Somebody mentioned her name, like, I know him. But yeah, that's Brookhaven's demographics will change its political landscape as well. In a much slower but much more dramatic way than Atlanta. Much more dramatic way. Yeah. Okay, interesting. Yeah. Could be.
Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I can tell you that Beaufort, Iowa was for me in my formative years, that 17, 18 years old, that it was a gift to me. And that, I just find myself. I could go and float in its waters and just spend some time. But it gave me access to cultures and activities and opportunities that I would never have seen before, had we not made this move. And so I think it is and continues to be a really important part of who I am. I think all of us leaves Beaufort Highway at some point, but Beaufort Highway really never leaves you. And so it is as a strip of geography, it's just never really left me. Yeah, it's as for the relatively short period of time that we really lived there, my attachment to it is even stronger than it is to my hometown in St. Louis. I call Beaufort Highway home. Yeah. That's what I say.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.